Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Friday. A good and Erev Shabbos to you. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Paul in the Great Northwest, Joe in the Inland Empire, Bella in Florida, Sharon in New Jersey, Gordo in Scotland, Renee wishing Shabbat Shalom. Paul says Shabbat Shalom. Lorraine in Texas, Shandora in the Bronx, Aoife in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia, Franco in Trieste, Italy, Marie in Freeport, New York. Welcome, everybody. Doubled off, but we've already done half of the first page. So our dafs today are pages 23 and 24 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. But we picked this up right at the top of page 23b with Mishna number 7 here in chapter 2. With regard to a dove chick, right, a baby dove, that was found within 50 cubits of a dovecote, it belongs to the owner of the dovecote. If it was found beyond 50 cubits from the dovecote, then it belongs to its finder. In a case where it was found between two dovecotes, if it was close to this one, it belongs to the owner of this dovecote. And if it was close to that one, it belongs to the owner of that dovecote. And if it was half and half, i.e. equidistant from two dovecotes, so the two owners divide the value of the chick. That's Mishnah 7. Now the Gemara. Rabbi Hanina says, when resolving an uncertainty with regard to the halachic, the legal status of an item, for example, a found item, if the status of the majority of like items, similar items, indicates that it has one status, but the item in question is proximate to a source that indicates otherwise, one follows the majority. And even though the halacha, the law of the majority applies by Torah law, and the halacha of proximity also applies by Torah law, even so, the majority is preferable. So, what we're kind of saying, well, what we are saying, we'll say it in a few different ways, but just to get this sense, right? So we have and the little bird. Okay, so imagine that we have two dovecotes. Okay, so I have a little dovecote. I have 10 doves in it, and my neighbor has a big dovecote. He has 50 doves in it. And a dove, and this is the halfway mark, between the two dovecotes. And we find a little baby chick here. So what's going on? This baby chick is obviously closer to this dovecote here. And therefore, if the two dovecotes were equal, certainly we would assume that this baby chick came from this dovecote. But in the totality of this area, 10 of the doves come, or let's say nesting pairs that would have chicks, but let's just say 10 of the doves total come from this dovecote and 50 come from this dovecote. So do we follow proximity over to this dovecote, or do we follow the majority and assume it came from this dovecote, since most doves in the area come from here, right? So proximity versus majority. And here we're learning that both are by Torah law. Therefore, if we could produce different solutions based on majority versus proximity, we're first going to look to majority, and that is the law. Okay. Where was I? Okay. Majority is preferable. So Rabbi Zera raises an objection from the Torah's statement with regard to a murder victim where the identity of the murderer is unknown. In other words, we find a body not in a city, not in a town, but out in the, in the fields somewhere. And it's a murder victim. This person was killed, but we don't know where the killer is. And so we're going to have to perform the ritual of the heifer whose neck is broken. And what they're going to do is they're going to measure which is the closest town and then bring the elders of that town to perform this ritual where they basically say, we're not responsible for this death. Now, why would we think that the elders of the town, these are obviously respectable people, would be responsible for the murder? No, it's not that we think that they might have actually killed the person, but rather they're attesting that this person who ended up being a murder victim didn't come to their town looking for shelter, was turned away, forced to go out into the sticks, into the boonies, and there he was killed. That's the sort of general concept. Why it's relevant here is because you have to measure to the closest town. Well, what if he's close to a town that has 100 inhabitants, and he's further away from a town that has 10,000 inhabitants, right? So even though he's closer to the town of 100, he more likely had some kind of interaction or indeed came from, this is probably an unidentified victim, but at any rate, it had more to do with the city that had 10,000 people in it than the town that had 100. So again, we have the question of proximity versus majority. So Rabbi Zera raises an objection from the Torah's statement with regard to this murder victim where the identity of the murderer is unknown. And in a case of this kind, the court measures the distances between the corpse and the nearby towns in order to determine which town is closest and must consequently perform the rite of the heifer whose neck is broken. And the verse states, quote, "And it shall be that the city that is nearest to the slain man, the elders of that city shall take a heifer of the herd and shall break the heifer's neck." It's an offering, a sacrifice that is made to expiate for any guilt that the town might have had in neglecting this person who ended up dead. And that's Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 3 and 4. And this town is chosen even though there might be another town that is larger in population than it. So according to Rabbi Hanina, in a case of this kind, one should follow the majority, right? So are we saying that we aren't going to follow the majority? We're not going to look to the town that has the much greater population. We're only going to look to the town that is closer. And I'll just read where the law came out about these two things. Just reading the halacha, that's what's nice about the Koran. So by Torah law, one follows both proximity and majority. And when these considerations conflict, one follows majority. Now, although the Torah states that in the case of a murder victim whose murderer is unknown, the closest town must bring the heifer whose neck is broken, this obligation is imposed on a more distant town if its population is greater. So again, we do follow the majority over the proximity. Now, the Gemara says, this verse is referring to a situation where there is no other town that is larger than that one. And the Gemara asks, and still, if one follows the majority, why should the court follow the closest city? Let us follow the majority of the world, as most people are found elsewhere, right? So what are we going to say? Okay, well, let's, if you could say that there's a town with 100 people in it, that's a mile away, and a town with 10,000 people, that's a mile and a half away. Now, you could certainly see, okay, well, the town that needs to do the ritual is the one with 10,000 people, even though it's a little bit further away. But are we also going to say, well, why are we even going to talk about that town? Right? Because the majority of people in the world don't come from either of these towns. The majority of people in the world come from elsewhere, right? Billions of people. So if we're going to follow the majority over proximity, why should any town ever perform this ritual, is what's being asked. Let us follow the majority of the world, as most people are found elsewhere. And the Gemara answers, this is referring to a case where the city sits in isolation between mountains, and therefore it is unlikely that the murderer arrived from elsewhere. I mean, there's good reason to believe that this town is the one that is somehow involved. Now, the Gemara continues to discuss the issue of majority as opposed to proximity. We learned in the Mishna, with regard to a dove chick that was found within 50 cubits of a dovecote, it belongs to the owner of the dovecote. And as the Mishnah does not make a distinction between different cases, it indicates that this is the law, even though there is another dovecote that is larger than the proximate one in terms of number of birds. And this shows that proximity, not majority, is the determining factor, right? Like I made this little drawing and I told you that, well, one dovecote holds many more doves than the other, and therefore we should follow the majority. But the Mishnah didn't say anything like that. The Mishnah only talked about proximity. So here the Gemara says that this is referring to a case where there is no other dovecote in the area. And so the first case of the Mishnah was within 50 cubits of a dovecote belongs to the owner of the dovecote. More than 50 cubits from that dovecote, it just belongs to the finder. We're not talking about two dovecotes. And the Gemara asks, well, if so, the latter clause of the Mishnah, that if it was found beyond 50 cubits from a dovecote, it belongs to its finder. And if there is no other dovecote in the area, it certainly fell from that dovecote. Well, then how then can it be given to the finder? There's no other dovecotes. Why would you say that even if it's more than 50 cubits, where else did it come from? It must have come from that dovecote and it just went more than 50 cubits away. And the Gemara answers with, what are we dealing here? We're dealing with a chick that hops from place to place, but does not yet fly. And as Rav Ukva Bar Chama says, with regard to any creature that hops, it does not hop more than 50 cubits. Consequently, any bird found within 50 cubits of a dovecote is assumed to have come from there. If it is further away than that, it likely came from elsewhere or was dropped by travelers. Is it impossible for a dove chick to hop more than 50 cubits? Of course not. It could hop more than 50 cubits, but the sages had to create some kind of a legal standard, and they settled on 50 cubits as the distance that baby chicks will hop. So less than that, we assume it belongs to this dovecote. More than that, we don't. Now, Rabbi Yirmiyah raises a dilemma. If one leg of the chick was within 50 cubits of the dovecote and one leg was beyond 50 cubits, then what is the law? And the Gemara comments, and it was for this question about this far-fetched scenario that they removed Rabbi Yirmiyah from the study hall, as he was apparently wasting the sage's time. Now that is somewhat amusing, but it's also surprising because many times we see that the sages will ask a somewhat ridiculous, far-fetched hypothetical, not because, they're wondering practically what do we do if such a case comes up, but rather to test our understanding of the law. Right? Now, in the Mishnah itself, it did say that if a chick was found equidistant from two dovecotes, so more or less one leg, was closer to one dovecote, the other leg was closer to the other, then the owners of those dovecotes divide the value. So, kind of similar to this extreme question that Rabbi Yirmiyah poses, where there's only one dovecote, but the chick is found with one leg within the 50 cubit perimeter that you would assume it came from that dovecote, and one leg outside it where the finder could keep it. So in this case, does the finder have to get a cubit measuring stick, count out the exact 50 cubits? It turns out that it's halfway. It splits the difference of the width of the dove chick itself. It's a very small bird, right? It's not the chick of a chicken, right? The chick of a dove, that's a very tiny bird. And they say that Rabbi Yirmiyah was dismissed from the study hall for asking such silly questions. That's surprising, right? Because they do ask very, like I say, hyperbolic questions to test what exactly the law would be. So there's a note here from Rav Steinsaltz citing Tosafos. So Tosafos, right, who included the grandchildren of Rashi, and there were many other commentators in that generation. So Tosafos explained that it was not due to the unlikelihood of this scenario occurring that they removed Rabbi Yirmiyah from the study hall, as it is common for the Gemara to clarify the limitations of halachos, of laws, Jewish laws, by discussing unlikely cases. In fact, the Mishnah itself addresses the case of a chick found precisely between two dovecotes. So rather, it was because there had been a definitive statement that a bird would not hop more than 50 cubits, according to which Rabbi Yirmiyah should have understood that it would not go further than that, even with 1 foot. And then we'll see on page 165, which is actually, this is a 2-volume tractate, so I don't have it here, the tale in which Rabbi Yirmiyah was finally invited back to the study hall. So hold on for that in another, 140, so another 4 months or so. Now, the Gemara further suggests, come in here, the Mishnah, in a case where it was found between two dovecotes. If it was close to this one, it belongs to this owner. And if it was close to that dovecote, it belongs to that owner. So the Gemara comments, and this is the law, even though one of them is greater in number of birds than the other one. This would indicate proximity is what matters, not majority. So apparently, right, one rules on proximity, not majority. And the Gemara explains, with what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a situation where the two dovecotes are equal in size. Meaning that if one was larger, we would follow majority over proximity. And the Gemara asks, but even so, why should one follow the closer dovecote? Let us follow the majority of the world, as there are many dovecotes besides these, and the number of doves they contain is greater. And the Gemara responds with, what are we dealing here? Now on page 24a, we are dealing with a path that crosses between vineyards, and these two dovecotes are situated there. As if it is so that you claim the chick came from anywhere else in the world, since it only hops, it could not have come there. So the reason is that any bird that hops and turns and sees its nest will continue to hop, but if it does not see its nest because it has gone too far, it will not hop further. Consequently, this found chick that hops must have come from one of these two dovecotes. It's not that we're going to bring into consideration all the other dovecotes in the world, because there's a limit to how far these hopping chicks will go. So Abaye said, we learn in the Mishnah, tractate Niddah, page 17b, as well that one follows the majority rather than proximity. So further proof that we follow majority over proximity. With regard to blood that is found in the corridor, now we're talking about female anatomy, and what we're going to be discussing is if a woman finds blood, either a spot of blood, on a sheet or on the floor or on herself. So the question is this regular blood because she has an injury or an illness and it's just some kind of regular blood, which is not tameh, right? Well, and does not impart ritual impurity. Or is it menstrual blood, which does impart ritual impurity, right? This is important when the temple was standing. And if you came into contact with a niddah, a woman who was having her menses, so that would, then you become ritually impure. And before you could enter the temple or come into contact with teruma, food set aside for a priest, you would have to go through the purification of immersing in a mikveh and awaiting nightfall, right? So you needed to know this spot of blood, was it menstrual blood or regular blood? And so here we're going to discuss, based on the location and the situation when it's found, if it's coming from a source that would seem to indicate menstrual blood, that would be proximity. If it's found in a situation where the majority of blood droplets that would end up in that location, you would expect that they would be menstrual blood. Then we're getting at that it is impure because it is menstrual blood. not through proximity, but rather by majority, right? So they're using the case of this uncertainty whether a drop of blood is menstrual or regular blood to help us analyze the question of proximity versus majority. So here we go. So with regard to blood that is found in the corridor, which i.e. this is the cervical canal, and it is uncertain whether or not it is menstrual blood, legally it is deemed tameh, ritually impure, i.e. that it is menstrual blood, as there is a presumption that it came from the uterus, which is the source of menstrual blood. And this is the law, even though there is an upper chamber which empties into the cervical canal, which is closer. In other words, she might have had some kind of a lesion, or a cut somehow, and it was regular blood. And that would be, actually, that source would be more proximate, but the majority of blood that flows through the cervical canal is menstrual blood, so we follow the majority. Now, Rava said to Abaye, in response to this claim, you state a proof from a case where the factors of majority and frequency are both present. So when there is majority and frequency, in other words, most of the blood that flows through this location is menstrual blood. That's majority. Or to say that menstrual, when you say most, it's like a larger volume or more often. Frequency and majority are actually both expressions of majority, but we might distinguish between volume versus frequency. They both are cases of majority, as when we're in contradistinction to proximity. But now we are drawing some kind of a distinction between majority and frequency, at least to the extent that these are two different proofs that both lead to majority. Right? So you state a proof from a case where the factors of majority and frequency are both present. When there is majority and frequency, there is no one who says that one ignores the majority and follows proximity. But here, not only is the blood from the uterus greater in quantity, it also passes through the canal more frequently, as blood generally does not come from the upper chamber, right? Blood generally does not come from some lesion or source other than the uterus, other than menstrual blood flowing through the cervical canal. Now, Rava cites a proof for his statement. As Rabbi Chia teaches, blood that is found in the corridor is considered definite menstrual blood, and therefore, if she engages in sexual intercourse, both she and her partner would be liable as a result of it to receive kares for entering the temple intentionally when ritually impure, or to bring an offering for entering unwittingly. In other words, they didn't know that it was her menses, right? It's not like they intentionally made love when she was tameh with having her period. Sometimes women bleed irregularly at a different time of the month, and that's when you would have reason to ask, well, is that menstrual blood or is it, some other source? Because normally at this time of the month, she wouldn't be bleeding. But let's say that they discovered this blood after making love, and they said, oh, looks like that is menstrual blood because of the location where it's found. Therefore, we assume it's menstrual blood. She's tameh and he's tameh because he came into contact with her. That's not why they get kares. They haven't done anything wrong. It was an accident. They still have to go through purification simply because they came into contact with a source of impurity. Where it becomes a transgression is if they, knowing that they are tameh because they came into contact with menstrual blood, if they then walked into the grounds of the holy temple or came into contact with teruma, then it would become a transgression. If they did that intentionally, they would need to atone for it. If they did it unwittingly, they could bring an offering for it, a chatas, when the temple is standing. Okay. Now, and Rava says, learn from that which Rabbi Chia said. From what Rabbi Chia just said, we can learn three conclusions. Learn from his statement that when the relevant factors are majority and proximity, follow the majority. And learn from his statement that the law, that one follows the majority, this applies by Torah law, as teruma is burned in this case on account of the blood, and she is liable to receive kares if she enters the temple in this state. And number 3, learn from this statement that there is a source for that which Rabbi Zera said. What did Rabbi Zera said? We're actually going to encounter what Rabbi Zera said in a different tractate, Tractate Kesubos, page 15a. So what did he say there? He said, if there are 10 stores in a city, and we read this halakha, you might remember it. If there are 10 stores in a city, 9 of which sell kosher meat, and 1 of which sells non-kosher meat, and a person found meat outside the stores, and he does not know from which store it came, so one follows the majority, right? So there are 10 stores in the town, 9 of them sell kosher meat, 1 sells non-kosher meat. So even if you found the meat outside the store that sells non-kosher meat, since we don't know which store it came from and it might have been dropped, it happens to be closer to the store that sells non-kosher meat. Nevertheless, in terms of meat that was dropped and found in this city or in this town, 9 out of 10 times it comes from the kosher butcher store. And so we can follow majority over proximity and assume that the meat is kosher. Now the Gemara there suggested that perhaps, in doing the analysis, the Gemara suggested that perhaps one follows the majority only in a case where the gates of the city are unlocked, when the meat could have come to the city from the majority of kosher meat outside, in a circumstance where the majority of the meat sold in the surrounding area was kosher. In other words, why is the city gates being unlocked? Why is that even relevant? Because let's say that this is a city in Israel where the vast majority of meat during so in a time when we're talking about an ancient Israel, but where the vast majority of people who lived in Israel are Jews and the only meat that they eat is kosher meat. So therefore we have 2 factors suggesting majority. We have that in this particular city, 9 out of 10 stores sell kosher meat. And in the greater surroundings of that city, by far most of the meat is kosher. So even if it was dropped by an outsider who happened to be visiting the city, still the majority applies. And so we have 2 majorities working together, right? 9 out of 10 stores in this city sell kosher meat. And let's say 9 out of 10 stores throughout the land sell kosher meat. And so with the gates unlocked, now we have 2 majorities working together. If the gates were locked, meaning that the meat must have come from one of the shops in this city, then we would only have 1 majority to work with. And then we might ask, well, do we still follow majority over proximity when there's only 1 majority at play? Or do we only follow majority over proximity when there are 2 majorities at play? Now, in this case, there are 2 majorities, the majority of kosher meat stores inside the city and the majority from the outside. And the Gemara there explains that Rabbi Zera says that even if the gates are locked, one follows the majority and the meat is kosher, as there is no need for a double majority. It's enough to follow the majority over proximity. You don't need the double majority. Now, the Gemara elaborates, the 2 cases are analogous, as the woman here, right, where we're talking about blood flowing, more blood that flows through this area by volume is menstrual, and by frequency is menstrual. Therefore, it's a double majority. So the 2 cases are analogous, says the Gemara, as the woman here is considered like the locked gates of the city, i.e. there's only a single majority, and even so, we follow the majority. We don't have to look at frequency and volume. The fact is, most of the blood that flows to that canal is menstrual. That's enough. Now the Gemara asks, but Rava is the one who says, with regard to the case of the blood, that when there is majority and frequency, there is no one who says that one ignores the majority and follows the proximity. In other words, Rava rejected this case as a proof of the principle that one follows the majority even when it is not frequent. Here, by contrast, Rava claims that one can learn from the ruling of Rabbi Chia that one follows the majority by Torah law. So the Gemara answers, Rava retracted that claim in favor of the opinion that one follows the majority in all cases. So again, we've come to the conclusion that where there's a conflict between majority and proximity, we follow majority. New subject. It was stated in the case of a barrel of wine that was found floating in a river, and the status of the wine was unknown. Rav says, if it was found opposite a town in which the majority of the residents are Jews, the wine is permitted, as it can be assumed that the wine belongs to a Jew. Therefore, it's kosher wine. What makes wine kosher? It's not that any difference of ingredients. It's that the wine was supervised had rabbinical supervision as the grapes were grown, as they were, picked, fermented, turned into wine, etc. And it's interesting because why was the supervision important? Like, there's no difference in flavor or ingredients or anything between kosher wine and non-kosher wine. The supervision is required to make sure that in all the processing, from the grape to the glass, none of that wine was ever used in avodah zarah, in idolatry, right? No wine was used as a libation, as an offering to some idolatrous god. Now, these days, right, when there's no idolatry to speak of, I mean, there are some idolatrous religions in the world, but very rare, right? And we would have no reason to believe, right, that wine from the Napa Valley, grown by some, I once met a guy named Fred Klein, not Jewish, who owns a winery that's become pretty big called Klein Wine Cellars, and he's, I don't know what his religion is, okay, but I'm sure he's not offering libations to any idolatrous god. Nevertheless, unless his wine, received a hechsher, received a kosher supervision stamp, we would not drink it, right? We're Orthodox Jews, and we would not drink non-kosher wine. And it's just so interesting that here, the sort of what we're guarding against has all but disappeared, but nevertheless, the process of kosher supervision remains in place. And so obviously, for Orthodox Jews, the world of wine that we drink from is a much smaller world than the broader world, of brands of wine around the world. Okay, let's get back to the matter at hand. Okay, so the point is here, we find some wine floating in the river, and we're not sure if it's kosher or not. Right? So what they're saying is, at least in this time and place, if the wine was owned by a Jew, then we can assume it was kosher because the Jews were drinking kosher wine. It wasn't like they were secular Jews and religious Jews, and the secular Jews were drinking whatever. The Jews in Israel, the Jews in Bava, if they were drinking the wine, it was kosher wine. So the only question we have to ask is, was this wine likely to have been lost by a Jew, that its previous owner was Jewish? If so, it's kosher and it can be drunk by Jews. If it was likely to have been owned by non-Jews, then the Jew cannot drink it. So let's get back to it. So if it was found floating in the river, right, a barrel of wine floating in the river, if it was found opposite a town of which the majority of residents are Jews, the wine is permitted, as it can be assumed that the wine belongs to a Jew. If it was found opposite a town in which the majority are Gentiles, it is forbidden, as it presumably belongs to a Gentile. And Shmuel says it is forbidden even if it was found opposite a town of which the majority are Jews. Why? Regardless of where it was found, one can say that it came from that place called Dekira, where the majority of the people are Gentiles. In other words, there is a distinct possibility that a floating barrel came from far away. Now, we're not getting into the idea that, well, if you find an object, there is a mitzvah, a commandment to return a lost object. So if you found this barrel of wine floating in the river, you would have to proclaim, I found a barrel of wine floating in the river. And if you can describe this barrel, it had any kind of distinct markings or the manufacturer of the barrel, and you lost a barrel of wine, come to me, identify it, and I'll give it back to you. Let us assume that that was not possible. there are no distinct markings, or they proclaimed it and no one stepped forward. So then the question is, does the Jew who finds it, is he able to keep it and drink it? That depends on did we find it in a situation where it was likely to be owned by Jews or not. Since it's a barrel floating in a river, now the Gemara is asking, well, why should it matter if it was found opposite a town where the majority of the residents are Jewish? A river flows. I mean, who knows how far away this barrel fell into the river, and now we found it as it came by this town, but who knows where it originated. And the Gemara suggests, shall we say that Rav and Shmuel disagree with regard to the statement of Rabbi Hanina, in that one sage, Shmuel, is of the opinion that this ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Hanina, and he rules based on the majority, which in this case includes even distant locales. And one sage, Rav, is of the opinion that the ruling is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Hanina, which is why he rules based on proximity, right? So proximity or majority. Now the Gemara rejects this suggestion. No, everyone agrees with the opinion of Rabbi Hanina. We do follow majority. The question is, do we know what the majority is? Here they disagree about this. One sage, Rav, holds that if it is so, that the barrel came from that place called Dekira, meaning upstream somewhere, we don't know where, well, this cannot be, as the currents and bays of the river, where the river flow is weak, would have sunk it. Therefore, it is logical that the barrel came from a nearby town. In other words, something about this barrel, the way it's constructed and the way this particular river flows, it couldn't have come from very far upstream. We have good reason to suspect that it comes from the town that it was found near. It's more like a lake than a town, than a river, let us say, for whatever the mechanical reason is. And one sage, Shmuel, holds that perhaps the force of the river caught the barrel and brought it, as it is evident that the flow of a river can bring items from far away. It's in a river. It could have come from far away. There's no reason for us to assume that it couldn't have survived the journey, so we don't know what town it came from. And the Gemara relates that Ravina deemed permitted a certain barrel of wine that was found hidden in a vineyard where there were orla grapes, and he was not concerned that the wine might be made from grapes of that vineyard, right? Orla means that the vines are young in their first 3 years. And so if somebody made wine from the grapes that were from the first 3 years of the growth of that vine, that would not be permitted because of the prohibition on eating the fruit of any tree or fruit tree or vine in its first 3 years. That's orla. And so here you would have reason, since the wine is found in a vineyard that is a new vineyard, and if it was made from grapes in that vineyard, it would be prohibited as orla. So do we say this barrel of wine, found in an orla vineyard must be prohibited because odds are it was made from grapes in that vineyard, and those grapes are prohibited? Or do we say, well, we know the grapes in this vineyard are prohibited. The owner surely knows the grapes in this vineyard are prohibited. So why would he make wine from orla grapes? There's a barrel of wine here, but most likely it was made from grapes from some other source and it ended up here. We don't know why. Do we say that? Or do we say, well, it was found in an orla vineyard, it probably was made from orla grapes, and we don't drink it? We don't know yet. So let's see, orla grapes. So the Gemara says, shall we say, let's read it again. Ravina deemed permitted this barrel that was found in a vineyard where there were orla grapes. Ravina said it's okay. There's no reason to assume that it was made from these orla grapes. Why? The Gemara asks, shall we say that this is because he holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Hanina, that one follows the majority of vineyards which are not orla, rather than proximity to this vineyard that is orla? And the Gemara answers, actually it is different there. As why was this wine barrel hidden in a vineyard? Perhaps it was stolen and stashed there. And if thieves had stolen the barrel from that very vineyard, well, they wouldn't have hidden it there. Since the barrel was hidden there, it is reasonable to assume that it was stolen from somewhere else, and the majority of vineyards are not orla, and that's why Ravina deemed it permitted. And the Gemara comments, and this matter, that thieves would not hide a stolen barrel in the same vineyard from which they stole it, applies only to wine. But they would hide grapes there, as grapes are not readily identifiable by the owner the way barrels are. Consequently, there is a concern that grapes found hidden there might be from that same vineyard, but we don't have that concern for a barrel of wine. Now, the Gemara further relates that there were these jugs of wine that were found between vines, kosher, of a Jew, right? Jugs of wine found between the vines that were owned by a Jew. And Rava deemed the contents permitted, and he was unconcerned that they might be wine owned by a Gentile, since it was found in the vineyard of a Jew. And the Gemara asks, shall we say that Rava does not hold in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Hanina, who says that one follows the majority, and the majority in this case are Gentiles. This is a vineyard owned by a Jew, but in a region where most of the vineyards are owned by non-Jews. So there, if we're following the majority, we should deem this found wine prohibited, because even though it's found in a Jewish vineyard, most of the vineyards are not Jewish. So if we follow majority over proximity, why would we deem these jugs of wine permitted? And the Gemara answers, there it is different. As the majority of those who pour wine from barrels into jugs are Jews, and therefore it is reasonable that the wine belongs to a Jew. This jug is further evidence that it belongs to a Jew, because for whatever reason in that time and place, Gentiles didn't use these kinds of jugs. And the Gemara comments, and this matter applies only to large jugs. But if they were small jugs, one can say that they were dropped by travelers, most of whom are Gentiles, and therefore the jugs of wine are forbidden. And if there are large jugs among the found jugs, say that they all belong to Jews, as travelers do not usually carry large jugs. It can be assumed that the small ones were placed to balance the donkey's load, and the jugs all fell together. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 7. Now we're on page 24b. We're starting Mishnah number 8. But you can see that the general takeaway is that in matters of uncertainty, we follow majority over proximity, and that we look at all the evidence before us of, do we know what the majority is? Okay, Mishnah 8. One must distance a tree 25 cubits from the city, and in the cases of a carob tree and of a sycamore tree, which have a great many branches, then they must be distanced 50 cubits from the city. Abba Shaul says every barren tree must be distanced 50 cubits. And if the city preceded the tree, as one later planted the tree alongside the city, right? The tree can't be closer than 25 cubits or 50 cubits in the case of certain species of tree. And so if the city was there and somebody planted his tree too close to the city, so the city preceded the tree, and someone came along and planted the tree alongside the city, and they tell him, hey, it's too close. So he has to cut down the tree, and the city does not give money to the tree's owner in compensation because he shouldn't have planted it there. And if the tree preceded the city, meaning his tree was there and then the city grew, so the edge of the city came within this setback that we need for between trees and the city, the tree grew into that zone, then the owner still has to cut down the tree, but the city compensates and gives money to the owner. And if it is uncertain whether the tree was first or the city was first, so he has to cut down the tree and the city does not compensate him. That's Mishnah number 8. Now the Gemara. The Gemara asks, what is the reason that one must distance a tree from a city? We see trees inside cities, alongside cities. Why would you say that a tree can't be so close to the edge of a city? And Orla says it is due to the beauty of the city, as it is unattractive for a city's walls to be obscured by tree branches. And the Gemara suggests, and let him derive this law from the statement in Tractate Arachin, that one may neither convert a field of a city into an open area surrounding the city, nor may one convert an open area into a field, as these have fixed places and measurements. We see this in Numbers 35 verses 1 through 8, And if one plants trees in a city's open area, he therefore turns the open area into a field. Now we learn in the Torah that when the children of Israel entered the promised land of Israel, and after the wars of conquest were completed, they settled the land. So all the tribes, each tribe had its own region of the land of Israel, except for the Levites. The Levites weren't given a parcel of land. Rather, they settled in the cities. And so these became Levitical cities. And the Torah says that about these cities, first, right around the city, there was a zone of 1,000 cubits in every direction that should be just open space. And then beyond that 1,000 cubit zone, there's another zone of 2,000 cubits, which are the fields, right? Where the people who live in the city can have fields that they farm right outside the city, right? So there's 1,000 cubits of open land and then 2,000 cubits of fields that belong to the residents of that city. And the open space needs to be open and the fields need to be fields, right? So having a tree, interesting, in the open space would turn the open space into a field. Presumably we're talking about trees that are more like orchard trees that you'd be, harvesting them. So let's get back to it. The Gemara answers, so if one plants trees in a city's open area, he thereby turns the open area into a field. And the Gemara answers, it is necessary to supply the reason given by Orla, that is unattractive to have trees near the city wall, as opposed to the requirements, the Torah requirements of the 1,000 cubits of open space and then 2,000 of field. So those are two different reasons, right? One has to do with attractiveness. The other says the Torah requirement of 1,000 cubits. So the Gemara says it is necessary to supply the reason that Orla gave about the attractiveness of the city walls. And that, why? Because this ruling is Orla's opinion is according to the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, who says one may convert a field into an open area and an open area into a field. So here we do not plant trees, not because you can't plant trees in the open area, but rather because it would be considered unattractive for the city to have its walls obscured by trees. And according to the opinion of the rabbis, meaning the majority who presumably disagree with Orla, according to the opinion of the rabbis as well, who say that one may not, who disagree with Rabbi Elazar, the rabbis who say that one may not convert a field into an open area, nor convert an open area into a field, one can say that this matter applies only to seeds, i.e., one may not plant seeds in a city's open area and thereby turn it into a field. But with regard to trees, we do plant them in an open area, and that doesn't change it into a field. But here, we do not plant trees. Why? Due to the ruling of Orla that they would obscure the walls and make the city less beautiful. And from where do you say, i.e., on what basis do you maintain, that there is a difference between seeds and trees? Maybe whether you plant seeds or trees in an open area, you would turn it into a field. As it is taught in a Baraisa that discusses the laws of Shabbos, with regard to an enclosure, a karpef, whose area is greater than 2 base sa, but that was enclosed from the outset for the purpose of residence, it is permitted to carry within it on Shabbos, regardless of its size, as it is considered a private domain. So if subsequently the greater part of it was sown with seed crops, then it is considered like a garden, which is not a place of residence, and therefore it would be prohibited to carry there on Shabbos. If the greater part of it was planted with trees, it is considered like a courtyard, which is a place of dwelling, and it is permitted to carry there on Shabbos. So clearly we do distinguish between seeds and trees and how they affect a parcel of land. And this shows that planting trees in an enclosure does not transform the area into a field, as is the case when seeds are planted, right? So trees don't turn an open area into a field, seeds do. New subject, the Mishna teaches, and if the city preceded the tree, he cuts down the tree, and the city does not have to compensate the owner. And the Gemara asks, what is different with regard to a cistern that the Tana of another Mishnah on page 25b teaches that if one plants a tree next to a neighbor's existing cistern, the owner of the tree cuts down the tree, and the owner of the cistern has to give him money. And what is different here, that the Mishnah teaches that the owner of the tree has to cut it down, but the city does not give him money. And Rav Kahana said, citing a popular aphorism, a pot belonging to partners is neither hot nor cold, right? This is similar to the saying that a committee is a group of people who individually can do nothing but can meet and collectively decide that nothing can be done. Right? So when a pot is owned by multiple partners, they can't agree on what to do with it, and it ends up neither hot nor cold. Meaning no one takes responsibility for an item that belongs to several people as opposed to a single individual. So here too, there is no specific person who will pay for the tree. That's the difference, right? In other words, you have to cut down your tree because it's too close to the city. But if the tree was there before the city grew and got close to it, they don't have to compensate you. Why? Because there's no single person in charge. Whereas if your tree was there and now your neighbor has a cistern that he added later, okay, you have to remove your tree because he needs his cistern more than you need your tree, but he has to compensate you. And it's, who compensates you? There's one individual, the owner of the cistern. He compensates you. So there's one person to look to as opposed to the case of the city. Now the Gemara asks, and what is the difficulty to begin with? Perhaps damage caused, in other words, why does it matter if this tree is near the city? What is the difficulty to begin with? Perhaps damage caused to public property is different from damage caused to the property of an individual. Consequently, when one's tree causes damage to the public, he is not compensated for having to cut it down, whereas he does receive payment when his tree damages a private cistern. So it's not the idea that you can't find someone to pay, it's that it's a different kind of damage when you cause damage to the public versus damage to an individual. Now, rather, if Rav Kahana's comment was stated in this context, it was stated about the latter clause. If the tree preceded the city, he cuts down the tree and the city gives money to the owner. Concerning this law, one could ask, and let the tree owners say to the city residents, give me my money first, and then I will cut down the tree. In this context, Rav Kahana said, a pot belonging to partners is neither hot nor cold, meaning if the owner of the tree is entitled to wait until he first collects the money, a good deal of time would pass before the tree would be cut down. Therefore, a community need not collect money and pay immediately, unlike an individual. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. And the Mishnah teaches that if it is uncertain whether this one was first or that one was first, he cuts down the tree and the city does not give money. And the Gemara asks, in what way is this case different from that of a tree along a cistern? Concerning which you said in the Mishnah that in a case of uncertainty, the owner of the tree need not cut down the tree. And the Gemara answers, there, if it was a case of uncertainty, right, which was first, the city or the tree, or in the case of a cistern, which was first, the cistern or the tree. There, if it were a case of uncertainty, if it was a case of certainty, the tree would not be subject to being cut down. Therefore, in a case of uncertainty too, we do not say to the owner of the tree, cut it down. In that case, if the tree preceded the cistern, the owner of the tree would not be required to cut it down. But here, if it were a case of certainty, the tree would be subject to being cut down, even if it preceded the city. And the only uncertainty is whether or not the owner of the tree would need to be compensated. Consequently, in a case of uncertainty also, we say to the owner of the tree, cut it down. And if the owner of the tree lodges a claim due to the value of the tree, as he wants compensation for it, we say to him, bring proof that your tree came first and then take your money. And since he has no proof, he ends up not receiving money. Just to get a little bit of, I'm going to go a little bit further since tomorrow night, it's so late still this time of year. We don't want to have a longer daf tomorrow after Shabbos. So Mishnah number 9. One must distance a permanent threshing floor 50 cubits from the city so that the chaff will not harm the city's residents. Furthermore, a person should not establish a permanent threshing floor even on his own property unless he has 50 cubits of open space in every direction. And one must distance a threshing floor from the plantings of another and from another's plowed field far enough that it does not cause damage. Presumably because when you're winnowing, threshing, separating chaff, etc., you're using the wind, and the wind is going to blow some of this detritus onto your neighbor's property. So that's a form of damage. If seeds could get, be blown along with this wind that could, then take root on your neighbor's property, that's another kind of damage. So you need some distance if you're engaging in these activities near your neighbor. Now the Gemara. The Gemara asks, what is different in the first clause of the Mishnah, which states a fixed measurement for the distance of a threshing floor from a city? And what is different in the latter clause, which does not provide a measurement, but simply states in general terms that you have to distance it enough that it does not cause damage? Why do we give a specific distance in the one case and not in the other? And Abaye said, in the latter clause, we arrive at the case of a threshing floor that is not permanent. This threshing floor must be far enough from a neighbor that it does not cause damage to his property. Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of a threshing floor that is not permanent? And Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Chanina, says it refers to any threshing floor where one processes such a small quantity of grain that he does not winnow with a winnowing shovel, but simply employs some other method that does not scatter the chaff as far. This is one resolution of the contradiction. Rav Ashi said that the phrase, enough that it does not cause damage, is not referring to a distance at all, but rather it provides an explanation. In other words, the Tana is saying, what is the reason for the ruling of the first clause? As follows. What is the reason that one must distance a permanent threshing floor 50 cubits from the city? It must be far enough away that it does not cause damage, and the sages determined that 50 cubits is that distance. And the Gemara raises an objection against the opinion of Abaye from a Baraisa. One must distance a permanent threshing floor 50 cubits from the city, and just as one distances it 50 cubits from the city, so too does one distance it 50 cubits from the gourds, cucumbers, plantings, and plowed field of another person, enough that it does not cause damage. And granted, this works out well according to the opinion of Rav Ashi, as he claims that in both cases, in both clauses, the same distance is required. One must move a threshing floor 50 cubits from a plowed field and from those plantings. But according to the explanation of Abaye, it is difficult. And the Gemara comments, indeed, it is difficult. And the Gemara asks, with regard to the Baraisa, granted, one must distance his threshing floor from his neighbor's cucumbers and his gourds, as the chaff from the threshing floor goes and penetrates into the heart of the flour and dries it out. That's a different kind of damage. But why must one distance the threshing floor from another person's plowed field? What damage will your chaff cause to a plowed field? And Rabbi Abba Bar Zavta says, and some say it was Rabbi Abba Bar Zutra, it is because he turns it into manure, i.e., the chaff acts like manure, and an excessive amount of manure damages the seeds that might have been placed into that plowed field. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 9, and God willing, we'll pick it up tomorrow night after Shabbos ends in LA, right at the top of page 25a with Mishnah number 10 here in chapter 2. Okay, a couple of questions. Sharon, that is not so far-fetched, actually. When people compete in the long jump, you always measure the distance to the farther back foot where they land. Consider this is a dove chick long jump event, perhaps. I love it, in terms of how far we can expect little chicks to hop. Joe Branson, realistically, the distance between the dove chick's feet is negligible. I guess the two of you were discussing. Joe Branson says, which dovecote? Wait and see from which dovecote the parents come to feed it. Very good. Why choose a dovecote? Let's wait and see. Perhaps this chick will find its way back, or its parents will fly over. And Bell Plummer says, CSI wine. Right, I guess we're talking about the forensic analysis. Is this wine kosher or not? Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. Have a wonderful, refreshing, rejuvenating, uplifting, meaningful Shabbos. And I look forward to learning with you tomorrow night. Now Shabbos is starting to end a little bit earlier and earlier. And I hope to get on the air tomorrow night, maybe 9:35 p.m. Pacific, maybe even 9:30. All the best. Good Shabbos.